I hope all are in and can hear me, and I have no side noises with this headphone. So welcome to this seminar, to this discussion, the importance of running an inclusive business. So we have Renée Adams here moderating the panel. We have three great panel members, Todd, Kurt, and Emma, whom Renée is going to introduce in a second. Just a bit of housekeeping at the beginning. So we would like to have an interactive sessions. Now for the start, I would like to ask you to mute yourself. When you have a question, unmute yourself or raise your hands in the chat, and then we will ask to unmute you and ask the question if you've raised your hand, or just unmute and ask the questions, or put in the comment if you would like to. So I hope we'll have an interactive sessions and a lot of also of input from our panel members as well as from the moderator. And Renée, I hand over to you to get started. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Bettina. Hi, everyone. Very nice to meet you. So I'm Renée Adams. I'm a professor of finance at the business school. I'm a finance professor, but I've studied gender for a very long time now. I wrote one of the most cited papers on board diversity, which, let me tell you, was not very popular when I wrote it. But nowadays, this is fortunately becoming a hot topic. So I'm very pleased to be able to, participate in events like these where we talk about these issues that are very dear to my heart. I have with me Emma Todd, Kurt April, and Todd Sears, and I'll briefly introduce them in just a second. So I just want to remind you what the point of this session is. It's basically, the title is The Importance of Running an Inclusive Business, Practical Advice for Leaders. So I guess the point here is that we're going to try to think about some practical things that we can do, right? So I come from the research perspective. What can we actually do in practice? That's going to be the goal here, and you will get much more out of this session if you participate, right? There's no point in sitting around and just listening. That's part of the point. You have to sort of implement practice what we preach, right? So if you guys participate, you'll get much more out of it. So I'm going to have a little question in a second to get you started. The things that we're going to be talking about, so first of all, we were going to start talking about why diversity is so important. I requested that we change it slightly to basically start talking about whether we need to justify diversity. And then what we're going to talk about is how does one actually enact change within an organization? We're going to talk a little bit about sort of thinking about what diversity even means. Diversity can mean many things to many different people. And then we're also going to talk about the role corporations have in sort of, transcending their own boundaries and sort of changing the landscape more broadly. Okay. So let me briefly introduce the speakers. So I have with me here Emma Todd. She's Global Inclusion Leader for Deloitte, and she leads on the development and delivery of the Global Inclusion Strategy. She has an extensive bio that you guys have all seen, so I'm not going to go through all of it, but clearly she has a lot of practical experience, and so we're going to be picking her brains on the practicalities. I also have with me here Professor Kurt April, who is currently the Allen Gray Chair, specializing in leadership, diversity, and inclusion at the University of Cape Town. And so he's going to be bringing his expertise and sort of, thinking about sort of the theoretical aspects, but to the discussion, but he also has a lot of practical experience. So we're looking forward to what he has to say. And then also Todd Sears, who's the founder and CEO of Out Leadership, the global LGBT plus business advisory company. And he partners with the world's most influential firms to build business opportunities, cultivate talent, and drive equality forward. And so he's going to be talking a bit about what it means to transcend corporate boundaries. All of our speakers have a lot to say about all the aspects of diversity. So, again, I put the balls in your court to pick their brains as much as possible. Okay, so I'm going to start, first of all, by trying to get you guys a bit warmed up. I told you before that I thought we should change the starting point of this discussion from why is diversity important to a different question, which is, do we need to justify diversity? Okay, so I would really love to hear what your thoughts are. And the point here is, presumably you've all heard about the business case for diversity. You've heard the arguments that, you know, diversity brings different viewpoints to the table. You've heard many arguments about why diversity is so important. Surprisingly, given all these arguments, it's still so hard to achieve diversity. Right, and so, but I have a sort of a bigger question, which is, do we even need to make an argument for diversity? Do we need to, for example, make a business case argument? And I will tell you that there are different perspectives on the panel. So feel free to jump in with any perspective here. There's no wrong answer. And if nobody says anything, I will reserve the right to cold call. So let me
Renee, do you want to start with the panel or do you want to start with the panelists? Like,
No,
do you want to like
let
the students start?
I want to let the students start.
That sounds good to me.
Yeah, so I will pick on somebody. So how about Topa Munica?
I'll pass. Sorry, I'll pass this one. It's
okay, no
I
problem.
it's so controversial for me to give my position right now.
Yeah, well, this is one of the problems in this whole discussion is it's a very sensitive topic, right? And there's a lot of ideologically charged opinions. And my personal view is that unless we start sort of talking about these issues, we can never change, right? So if everyone sort of beats around the bush, you can never change anything. So I would say that this is a safe space where people can voice their opinions. How about Camila Diaz?
Yes.
Okay, is there somebody speaking?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Do you guys hear me right? Okay. Unfortunately, it feels like we shouldn't have to justify it, but unfortunately, the reality is that there are many places that still haven't completely caught on. They have bought into the idea, but they probably don't understand or don't have a clear answer on how to reach better inclusion and have better practices. So yes, I think in most cases, making a case is necessary.
Okay, so that's a good point. So in order to get people to actually implement change, one needs to make a case, right? Anybody have a different opinion?
So mine is not a different opinion, but I think just to add to making a case, personally, I think it's necessary so that it moves from an emotional discussion about, or a very charged discussion, and it moves away, it neutralizes the discussion. So even if somebody is potentially or holds certain prejudices, it, I think, adds, okay, what I really want to say is, as a Black female, I find that people think that it should be a handout, or people who are not deserving get certain roles. But I think once you put it into a business case and you start thinking intellectually about it, it then doesn't discredit me as somebody who's adding diversity. And you kind of see more of the facts as opposed to seeing the negative side of inclusive discussions or quotas, or, you know, the like. I don't know if that makes any sense. But for me, I think there's a place for it to make it more valuable for all parties involved.
Okay, well, I think that's an interesting perspective because, I mean, you know, as an academic, the way I interpret what you're saying is it's important to sort of bring everything that's very ideologically charged into sort of an objective basis. And so if you make, for example, the business case argument, we know how to measure sort of changes in value, right? So we can measure the impact of diversity And so from a research standpoint, that argument definitely appeals to me, right? So we strip out the ideology and we say, here are the criteria that we care about, and let's try to achieve these criteria, right? Anybody have a different opinion?
Looks like
No?
Sarah Emerson raised her hand there.
I think more. Oh yeah, Sarah.
Oh, hi, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just offer a different perspective. Would say no, we don't need to try to justify it. You know, again, I think that what others have said makes sense. That we do want to outline the business case. And I actually used to work in the women's empowerment space and did that, of course. And we've read the various reports, such as what was it, the third billion, you know, looking at the economic cost of not including women to their full capacity in the formal economy, et cetera. I'm just reminded of, I believe it was a week or two ago with the economics and mutuality discussion that was not as much on diversity and inclusion, but more on sort of broader ways of utilizing all forms of capital, human and otherwise, and in particular on sustainability issues. I was struck by what the speakers were sharing, and it really was nothing new, going back into what was already known and published by Dennis Meadows in 1972 with the Club of Rome. And ultimately, I think it was one of the last things that was shared at the very end was, you know, we have known this for decades and decades as far as what we need to do, you know, sort of intellectually. And ultimately, it's going to come down to what are our values, what are our morals. And as Adam Grant has recently shared in his book, you know, we tend to find that logical arguments are fairly ineffective anyway, and that ultimately it will come down to an emotional case. So I can see both sides. We already know that the data justifies it, but will we change our behavior? I think that ultimately we'll see that we're humans and we need to understand it from the heart. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So thanks for bringing in slightly different perspectives. So so I also think there's the moral angles to this are very interesting, which is what you raised, right? So there is an element of morality to this whole discussion that I think is often glossed over in a lot of the debate around diversity. And if you think about the question, right? So do we need to justify why diversity matters? You could rephrase it and say, do we need to justify why it's okay to remain undiverse? Right? I mean, so basically we're saying, is it, you know, we have to justify changing the status quo, but one can also say one has to justify remaining in the status quo, right? So there are different perspectives to this question. And I think it's important that one doesn't take a one-sided view. I guess to be a bit, you know, a bit jokey here, one has to have a diversity of perspectives on the issue of diversity, right? Okay, so with that, thanks everyone for participating, and hopefully you'll continue to be involved. Let me turn over to our panel. Is there anyone who wants to jump in on this question right away, or otherwise I will exercise my right and pick on you guys?
Sure, Renee, I'm happy to kick it off.
Okay, thank you, Kurt.
Thanks. I'd like to make a distinction between, you know, diversity and actually inclusion. I think, you know, the hard work of diversity still needs to be done on many fronts. You know, the most obvious, more superficial view of diversity that is still problematic is around gender, around issues of race or ethnicity, around diverse ability, or one might say disability and so on, and around gender fluidity. You know, those are the obvious ones. But we are actually diverse in all the ways we differ, right? We come from different backgrounds, different educations, different upbringings, different value systems, different sexual orientation. And so I think diversity is about all of us. And when we frame it only in narrow lenses, we exclude some and we include others. And that's when people start questioning the credibility of their appointments, the credibility and they talk about feeling like tokens or feeling like imposters and so on. So I do think we have to widen the conversation of what diversity is. We all differ, and we should focus on all the ways in which we differ. I would also like to just push back on the point of, we must make only a business case. I've spent 2 decades making business cases around the world to corporations. But diversity is emotional for the majority of the world who is not privileged. It is emotional, it is subjective, and they experience it like that. And I think by trying to take emotion out of it, we're losing the real power of diversity. I think we must be mature and adult enough around the world to take the emotion and the business case together. I don't think it's a either or, I think it's an and. One last point is, I think when we eventually get to diversity, I think the harder work is around inclusion, inclusive behaviors, how broadly we want to be open to people who are different to us, our willingness to let go of control, even let go. I mean, as EMBA students, just think about the knowledge that's been dished up to you, for instance. In strategy, you're going to learn about Porter's 5 forces and value chain, BCG models, resource-based theory. That's fantastic. But think about where that knowledge comes from. Where was that knowledge produced? Europe and the US, in the main. How many models are you learning from Asia? Do you even know about Tucson Ren, for instance, the organization who developed just-in-time systems? They're the size of McKinsey, but no one really draws on their frameworks. Can you name me one strategist you draw on from the continent of Africa or from Latin America in your thinking and strategy development? Who are you reading in your books? Are you reading someone from Sierra Leone or Vietnam or from Chile or from Alaska? Or are you reading people from, Norway? So even in our knowledge construction, we have to think about the diversity of thought we're exposing ourselves to, and how narrow our lenses are as we think about being more inclusive with the rest of the world. So I'm going to stop there, Renée, just to kick off your what do we need to justify diversity.
All right.
Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Kurt. And actually, maybe this is a good point at which I abandon my original question and move on. Since you raised the issue of inclusion, maybe this is a good segue into actually thinking about how do we achieve inclusion, which is an important topic, right? So we can, let's say we all agree, which presumably we all do, that diversity is super important, right? So I guess we're sort of preaching to the choir here, right? But then how do you actually implement diversity? And there, Emma, if you don't mind, if I pick on you a bit, because you have so much practical experience, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, thank you. And just to say that it was great to listen to some of the group's answers around this. And in terms of the first question, I'm a mixture of the two. It's head and heart. And the reality is, someone that has, was put into a role for Deloitte UK back in 2013. I'm now in a global role, spanning many more countries. But, I was put into a position where effectively I was pretty much told that we had to fix the problem that we had around from a diversity perspective. And our most obvious problem was a gender perspective. But actually, to Kurt's point, frankly, it was across the board. But the one thing we could measure, and this comes down to, as a business, if we're serious about something, what do? We measure it. We report on it. We report progress. We set targets. Do you know what? We don't give it a campaign name. We don't give it to an ERG or to someone that doesn't have a seat at the table. We give it to someone that has a seat at the table. And in my view, too often, diversity still is not given to anybody with a seat at the table. I was lucky in that it was given to me. I'm actually a corporate finance partner by training, and then was, asked to take on this leadership role, knew nothing about it. But apart from my own personal experience as frequently the only in the room, and my own experience of what I call everyday culture, not only in Deloitte, but in my previous organizations as well. And so, you know, we sort of come back to how do you do this? And, you know, and do, you know, do we need to refer to business case and commercial case? Yes, we do still, because we've got to show the both sides, in my view, and that's how I did it. So the first thing I did was I looked at my data, and I could see that every year, those that we were losing due to culture, that was £68 million on the table every year. And I wanted to get that number. I wanted to cost it, because for those that I knew, you know, would need some push around commercial case, I needed that number, but I also needed to show progress 4 years down the line. I wanted to show that this had made a difference. Now then, so I sort of did that. And then actually, I am with Kurt in that, look, to me, so we have what we talk about, a foundation of respect and inclusion. And then we have various pillars. And those pillars are things that we believe are broken and that we need to fix. And those are processes that we may have come up with 100 years ago, that we still think for some reason are clever. You know, why do we think it's a good idea to put someone in front of a panel in order to promote them? It still defies belief for me. But it's these sort of processes. Why with recruitment do we put so much decision making amongst certain groups of people in the process? So effectively what we did was we had to focus on single areas as well, knowing that you have culture that's critical to all. And that for me was about behaviors. And that's still ongoing. We're still working on that. And these are they're microaggressions. They're those everyday behaviors. They're throwaway comments. They're jokes at someone else's expense. They're those things that creep in and have crept in and then sadly have allowed to continue. And then the person that's on the receiving end thinks they're either too small, or frankly, if it's someone more senior than them, it's terrifying, the thought of raising it. And so we had to change that. We had to get trust. We had to have our CEO, you know, we hit the headlines of the FT 2 years ago. You know, some of you may have seen it. Deloitte fires 20 partners. We're still, you know, hitting the headlines on this sort of thing, and I'm well aware of that. But it, you know, it shows that we are actually taking action, and often these are very senior individuals. And so it's getting that trust, having that foundation, making sure that everyone is clear on your values, on the power of inclusion and the power of respect. And then we do need the interventions. If recruitment's broken, you've got to fix it. And we did. And we saw within 3 years a significant increase of the number of women that we were recruiting. And it's those aspects again I think you need to do. And then finally, the CEO and the exec has to own this. They have to be measured against it. It has to count at year end. It has to count in how they're rewarded. And finally, transparency. We need to report publicly on this. And I think the ESGs will really help organizations with that. It's asking for data that, you know, you've got to start reporting this stuff.
All right, thanks so much, Emma. So I would imagine that there might be some students here who have questions on these issues. Anybody want to jump in here? No questions, all clear?
I have a question for Emma. The numbers that you gave, the metrics, what you were measuring, what were those numbers based on? What was the case?
They were based on, so we took all our managers, and by the way, this was only for managers and senior managers. This wasn't for everybody. And we knew, when I looked at it from a gender perspective in particular, we knew that we had pain points. So we knew we had a problem recruiting because frankly, we weren't attractive enough, and we blamed the market. No, it wasn't the market, it was us. It was the language we were using. It was the process we were using. So again, we had to do something about that. And then we looked at the career path, and what we saw was a drop at manager and a drop at senior manager. And what happens? As you go onwards, basically your pipeline is diminishing the whole time. So we took, for manager and senior manager, we came up with what we believe was the appropriate way to do this, the cost of replacement of all of those women that we lost in one financial year for a cultural reason that typically relates to work-life balance or their everyday work. And we applied, I was actually told at our board that I'd undercooked it. I don't believe we did, but we looked at, you know, the time it takes someone to wind down, the time it takes to replace somebody, the time, the client, the lost client relationships, the recruitment fees, all of those things. I'm happy to share that with the group after this if it's helpful, because it was a sort of thing you can't argue with. You know, we were very clear, we set it out, and actually nobody did. And bear in mind, I work with a bunch of auditors who love auditing everything, and nobody argued with that. So, but that was basically the number. I needed a number. I needed something I could throw out every moment of the conversation.
Renee, could I jump in with a
Actually,
couple thoughts?
I would love. Yeah, could I just say one thing that I would love to see this, if you're willing to share, Emma, this is great, because I've always thought that people put too much emphasis on recruiting and not enough on retention. And this is getting precisely at this issue. So yes, Todd, jump in, please.
Thank you. And you know, I'd agree both with Kurt and Emma. I'd have a slightly different perspective, though. I think one of the ways I always try to frame these conversations is you can either look at it as a problem or an opportunity. And I think too often we're looking at the negative. We're looking at this is a problem to be solved. There's a guy named Martin Davidson, to Kurt's point of different perspectives in terms of theoretical. He's at Darden School at UVA, which of course is in the US, which is you know, where I'm based. And he looks at it between managing diversity and leveraging difference. And if you're managing diversity, it's a problem to be solved. It's only focused on the 6 areas of visible difference. It's stuck in HR. It has no business connectivity. Straight white male majority have no role to play, and they're actually often villainized, versus leveraging difference, which to Kurt's point is all of our acquired diversity and inherent diversity, right? It's all the things that people bring to the table. It's rooted in business. Why does this matter to your business? When I was head of diversity at Credit Suisse and Merrill Lynch, I used to meet with every head of business, and I would say, I'd walk in without these diversity metrics, and I'd say, just tell me about your business. Where do you have problems? Where do you have opportunities? Where do you have challenges? And then let's talk about how diversity or the makeup of your employee base can actually help you do that. Because too often they've been told, oh, finger wagging, you don't have enough women, you're the problem. And nobody wants to be a problem. Everybody wants to be part of the solution and the opportunity. And the leveraging difference mindset really does achieve that, because it is rooted in business. I would comment on a couple of the things Emma said that I completely love, because it is so sort of systemic in business. Too often, organizations will take a diverse person, a senior diverse person like Emma, and say, you're a woman, you go fix this for us. You're a person of color, you go fix this for us, right? And Emma, you actually said, right, you were the only one, so they chose you. Luckily, you're incredibly smart and competent and you can do the job. But that's an awful lot of pressure. How different would it have been if they took the straight white CEO and said, you fix this, right? You are part of the majority. You arguably don't have a dog in the fight, even though that's absolutely not true. And so too often people, the minority is always has the obligation of educating the majority. And that's an unfair position for any, as one of the students actually mentioned, in terms of being a Black woman, the business case helps her not feel like a token, right? Because then it actually creates that space. And I think, you know, if you think about the structural pieces and all the things that all these companies focus on, absolutely. But policy does not equal culture. I think, as one of the other students said, we've had these, you know, nobody can argue there's been diversity research for 50 years, and yet we haven't solved the problem. So clearly it's not intellectual only. It is head and heart, as you said, Emma. And then the final thing I would say is that ultimately, even in measurement, I look at leading versus lagging. So what I mean by that are representation is a lagging indicator. It's the result of your culture the last 3 to 5 years. And too often companies say, we don't have enough of insert blank here, whatever that is, women, people of color, LGBTQ people, you name it. And we have too much of this, generally straight white men. Well, what does that do? One, that creates a value equation that's completely, you know, terrible, right? The straight white men get the message that they don't matter because you have too many of them. And the people of color, the women, everyone else gets the message that the only reason you care about them is an immutable characteristic that has nothing to do with their skill set. So you're bringing them into an organization simply because of that visible characteristic. And there's this resentment that's created. It's not based on anything business related. And so if you sort of take that to the final level, the leading indicator is engagement and all of those pieces that you were talking about, Emma, in terms of retention. But you have to look at the cultural underlying challenges, the microaggressions, et cetera. But equally, what is the opportunity? You know, one of the things our leadership does around the world, we have 85 companies. Nike just joined this week. I work with 650 plus CEOs. We have summits on 5 continents. And all of those conversations are rooted in the idea that business should drive equality because it matters to the bottom line. And when you get people focused on it from a bottom line perspective, it becomes systemic and sustainable to everything that they do. And that's how you make this something that actually they don't just put to the ERGs or don't just put to HR. It actually has to be a business initiative. And I don't think that negates it. I think the moral case is still there, but businesses are for profit. They will only do things in their long-term sustainable best interest. And I think that's how we have to root this, because then they will actually see the opportunity and they will do more.
So I have a question for Todd. So I think those were great points. And I actually, maybe we could talk a bit more about how this actually works in terms of like advocating for here's an opportunity, let's change the skill sets. So let me get back to that. But I have like an immediate question. So I wrote a paper on the business case. And so one of my problems with the business case, which I'm curious to get your reaction on, is if you make the business case argument, it's very easy to tell whether the improvement in performance has actually happened, right? And so what happens if performance does not go up? Is that then a justification for not having diversity?
So
what's your reaction to that, Todd?
That's a great question. I would be hard pressed to find an example where having broader perspective, smarter people, more innovation, better diversity of thought and perspective, new access to markets, better retention, overall better engagement. I don't think you can find a case where that hasn't improved business outcomes.
Well, in theory, right? But like, so if you take the sort of business case for diversity, for gender diversity in particular, seriously,
yep.
It's very easy to measure. If you have more women, is that associated with an increase in shareholder value, right?
Yeah.
And so that I'm just wondering, because like I see the arguments for making the business case, but then if the business case fails, that has a consequence that may be actually a backlash towards diversity, right? So
I think it does. I think, well, I'd say a couple things. I think one, there's a Peter Drucker quote that I love, which, for our business school colleagues, I'm sure he's in other theaters that you might have read, which is, in business, you don't have to change. Survival is optional, right? And the idea that you can absolutely, I would, use examples from banking. I would go in and it would be an entire straight white male group around the table. And they would say, look, our profits were fantastic, right? Why, we're good. And I'd say, that's great, you're good now, right? But where are you going to be in 5 years? And how are you going to innovate? And if you look at the market meltdown in 2008, right? What was one of the great articles that if it had been Lehman Sisters versus Lehman Brothers, would it have failed? Right. So I think there's not just, did it work and did it deliver value last week, but how are we moving these organizations forward? And I don't think you can make a case that these companies, take the pension funds, for example. We, and to your board work, actually, Renee, Out Leadership has an initiative called Quorum. It's the first and only LGBTQ board diversity initiative. And we just published a piece of research last month, the first ever LGBTQ board research. And the idea that board diversity globally does not include LGBTQ people. And so we were digging into why that is. And more importantly, what is the business case for that? We've been able to get the New York City, New York State, CalPERS and CalSTRS, as well as AICD in Australia, to start to include LGBT in the definition of investment mandates that they have. That's almost $3 trillion of assets just in the US that include LGBT in the definition of diversity for what they will spend their investment capital on. That's forward thinking, right? So if there are companies that don't have LGBTQ in their board diversity policy, that would be a forward-thinking, proactive reason for them to do that. So I think to answer your question, you can always look back and say, okay, well, maybe that didn't work. And there are a lot of diversity initiatives that have failed in the last 30 years. In fact, I would say a lot of them, because they have been stuck in HR. They have been only focused on problems. They have not focused on business opportunity. They have focused on tokenism. They have been this sort of old school command and control. We need more women, go hire more women. We fail on those women, so let's go hire some more women, right? So they actually have failed for a very long time, which may actually account for why some of these diversity cases have not worked. But there are so many great examples of how they have, and I think that's where I tend to focus.
Renee, can I just add to that? Sorry, and Todd, I agree with so much of what you've been saying. I just to caveat, I wasn't the only woman at Deloitte. We had lots of them. But I do agree with your point. So I wasn't. For me, I think that I was a corporate finance partner I'm not an HR person. I don't have that background. And when, my big thing was, I am part of the business. I am part of, part of the challenge here. I've lived it. I see what happens. So, and I do think that's so important, is putting it in, it's a business challenge. So you have a conversation that's in the business language. And then Renée, from your view about sort of measurement, and about the business case, to me, the business case wasn't really, it was very different. And I think this is more aligned with Todd. It was about increased engagement. It was about, retention. We spend a fortune every year. And I just saw one of the comments. It's not just about going out and hiring a load of people. No, this is about, yes, you hire people, but you retain them. And then it's about, we thrive on clients. We are solely client service. And let me tell you, if we do not start reflecting what our clients expect, we won't have a business. And so for us, it was less about the financial. It was less about me showing, look, here's the impact on the bottom line. It was more around, frankly, if we want to stay as, a leading services organization that gives the best insight, the best diversity of thought, the best service, and open to innovation, new ideas, we have to change our culture. We don't have, and it was very much around culture. It was around everyday culture, things that we had built into the way we work, things we accepted, that we thought were acceptable. That's what the big thing for us was, and still a journey for us. But so I just don't think business case is just about the bottom line. I think it's far bigger than that. It's about staying relevant.
I would also add, Renée,
Yeah, no.
As Todd has spoken
Go ahead,
about,
Kurt.
that diversity is great for all aspects of the business. I'll push back a little bit on that. I'm all for diversity. However, many years ago, when I still worked as an engineer in subsurface at Shell head office, Shell did the hard work of developing very granular business cases for each part of their businesses around the world. And having measured for many years the link of, how many patents and how many less errors and safety, all linked to diversity, turnaround times and so on. Having done all of that work for them globally, they came to the conclusion that 13% of the business, 1-3, is not served well by diversity. So for instance, I'll give you one example, a blowback team. So this is a team who reacts to a fire or an explosion on an oil rig that's coming back up a pipeline from undersea. The more homogeneous the team, the better the outcome. So Shell did the hard work of finding where diversity over many years actually increased the business outcomes, whatever that is, whether it was bottom line, less turnaround time, fewer errors, less human accidents, whatever, greater reputational market equity and so on. They could measure all of those, but they did find that 13% of their business, diversity was a detractor, not an enabler. So that was very interesting for me. I come from a heart belief that diversity is great for everything, but I was schooled in the fact that actually there are times where it doesn't play a role. So I just want to bring that in to kind of balance the conversation we have.
Renée,
Yes,
we have a
thank you,
few
Kurt. And
raised
actually,
hands. We have a few raised hands. Would you
yeah,
like to take
I
some
got it.
questions now, or would you like to continue?
Yes, I will take the questions now. I just wanted to follow up on what Kurt said briefly. So I think Kurt's point is a very good one, and it's very important to realize that there is a literature that argues that homophily can actually be very valuable, especially sort of interestingly in times of crisis. And given that we're in a pandemic, it's sort of interesting to think about, this idea that while maybe you don't always want to have people who are different from you working together, you may actually in some cases need to work with people who think exactly like you. So thanks, Kurt, for bringing that up. So yes, I would like to open the floor now to, and I don't know who was first, but let me go by alphabetical. So Binta, do you want to ask a question?
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I've listened with great interest the various and very interesting point all of you made. And in my view, I mean, what I often notice is that hiring a diverse workforce is just one part of the equation. The second part, as some of you alluded to, is how do you actually, how do you make them, how do you insert them equally in the organization, and how do you incentivize them, how do you support them? And I think that's where I think many organizations have failed, in my opinion, because they do hire a diverse workforce, but then those people are often left to themselves. They have to basically, and if you think about it, those diverse, the people who come from a diverse background have often been, like it was the case of Emma Cod, the only one in the room. So you need that special support. That is actually the key for success. And I wonder, going back to Kurt April's example of 13% of diverse teams that didn't fail, I wonder if those diverse members of the team were given adequate support to be successful. So I'd like to have your view on that, if possible.
Yeah, anyone from the panel want to jump in? Thanks, Binta.
Yeah, Binta, so it was 13% within Shell, 13% of the kind of work they do that wasn't served well through more diverse teams. Actually, homogeneity was more beneficial than greater diversity. But for 87% of the business, they could literally measure that diversity was actually an enabler enhancing the business. But you are right. I mean, there's some great research currently coming out of Brunel University in London, where they're looking at the atypical pathways of leaders. So issue where you talk about the need for support, you're right, that when people come in with diversity, the support is not normally, yes, you can help around job and networks and connecting people because we need that to succeed in leadership. But what's interesting from the Brunel research is they went right down to the psychosocial dimensions. So for instance, things that you don't often see in diversity literature, for instance, intergenerational trauma, right? So they see that people who are not prototype. So let's say a prototype of a particular leader in an industry is a certain kind of person with a certain kind of background, and you find lots of them in a certain organization. People who are not like that prototype, called atypical people, they often manifested long-term generational trauma. In the UK, for instance, people from BAME backgrounds reported and measured issues around higher levels of anxiety and rage, depression, fatigue. That, that's the areas you need the support in. Yes, we need it in the skills and the business networks, but we kind of miss the other kinds of support. We find white folk who are not typical white folk, so not from the right school or the right background, or don't have the right accent. They too find trauma through issues like shame. They carry shame for not being like the prototype. They carry issues that the NHS can actually link to high blood pressure, to diabetes, to depression, and here we need support, which you don't often find in the diversity literature. We find people who, beauty bias coming in, right? So even if we just took the US, in the US, 15%, 15% of people are over 6 foot tall. But if you look at US CEOs on listed stuff, on listed companies, over 60% are over 6 feet tall. So that talks to, assumptions around who leaders should be. So that immediately means that if you're a shorter person, if you're slight of size, if you're 55 kilograms, how does that place you as an atypical person? What kind of support do you need? If you don't have the right skin tone or the right hair texture, you got a rural background rather than an urban background. These are important areas where support is needed, in addition to the traditional things we need in business around sport. So there was a whole series recently, and in fact, one of the most cited psychological journals, Frontiers in Psychology, based in Switzerland, actually published a series of papers of leadership pathways for atypical people. And I'd encourage you to read it. It touches on areas that you wouldn't normally find in the diversity or the leadership literature. Yeah. Thanks, Jen.
Can I, Renée, just
thanks, Kurt.
Sorry, Renée.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say, because we had another question, so I want to get to Sarah. But did you want to have a brief comment, Emma?
Very briefly, all I wanted to say is I think too many organizations, when they think about support, they take a fix the person approach based on their stereotypical view of what that person needs. So all women, guess what? Apparently we don't have confidence. We need to be taught how to negotiate. All of these things that drive me mad. And actually the thing that I found to be the greatest support, certainly in our organization, and I've seen it work, is, there is some programmatic element needed. We need to match. We need to get that sponsorship to happen. If it's not going to happen naturally, we've got to force it. And we've got to have reverse mentoring. And we've got to, it's those things that I think you do need to force to make it happen, because it is not going to happen naturally when the majority of your organization is, that sort of prototype that Kurt's talking about, is thinking, doing things in a particular way. But I have seen that after three plus years, you start to change it and you start to naturally get those choices. So just from a practical perspective, those are things that I've actually seen that have worked.
Yeah, that's great, Emma. I share the frustrations with women can't negotiate. We shy away from competition. We're risk averse, all those things, right? So anyhow, Sarah, sorry for the long wait. Do you still have a question?
Well, yeah, I was curious if you could speak to some areas that I'd like to just briefly highlight. I think taking a bit of what Todd had mentioned earlier around a lot of what we're talking about, sort of rooted in and coming from sort of the idea of the white man sort of Western lens. And that some of the challenges, he's not saying this is my perspective, that in this case, talking about gender diversity in helping to bring women to the table, right? So maybe the symbolic diversity and then inclusion and wanting to, maybe center conversations around women. The idea being that sometimes we don't want to lean into, to use that phrase, we don't want to lean into what are existing cultures or norms, and that, there needs to be an openness to adaptation at an organizational level from a real embrace of what is new. So it's not so much just ticking the box and saying, okay, great, we've heard about this, but I would see it more reflected perhaps in ways of broader gender equity. And so that would, for example, then open the way to more discussions on, paternal leave, family leave policies, as opposed to it being just women focused, for example. And I think the other aspect of it is, sort of a moral hazard that I'd certainly experienced, at least in the women's empowerment space, where, women have additional access now in the formal economy and workforce, but without sort of taking a holistic lens and looking at, well, how are we engaging men and partners or family members from a time poverty standpoint and helping to alleviate some of the, other burdens that women might face. We're simply adding an additional responsibility, to that particular gender's, responsibilities and time responsibilities. So I think that there's that sort of broader holistic lens that might be reflected outside of this conversation, again, just from a business value standpoint. And that, again, I think will go back more towards some sort of a moral argument, although you might see the positive externalities reflected, in the community as well as the business. But it's not just sort of to serve that end. So yeah, I was just curious if you see leading practices or maybe Emma's experience that at Deloitte. Thank you.
All right,
Renée, can
thanks
I
so
comment
much,
on that?
Sarah. So actually, yeah, I was just going to say I'm going to hand this over to Todd because this feeds very well into some of the work you've been doing.
Well, and I'm sure
So
Emma
go
has
ahead.
a thought too. So Sarah, thank you for the comment and the question. Lots of immediate thoughts. One, I would actually echo what Kurt was talking about as well. The idea of covering, which is what we've talked about but not really named, which is the idea that you're hiding an aspect of your identity in the workplace. We just did some global research this last year and found that 18% of LGBTQ people in Europe still cover even though they're out. And the idea of hiding an aspect of your identity in the workplace, actually one of the things that I think is so great about it is it universalizes the experience of being different. Straight white men cover, as Kurt was saying, around background or access. Black women cover around their hair. Gay people cover around mannerisms or their family. Women cover around all the other pieces that Emma was talking about. And if you focus on uncovering, then everyone feels better about it. You may have a disabled child. One of the examples we use actually with the vice chair of EY is on our board and has a trans son. And he talked about as a straight white male of privilege, which we haven't really talked about privilege today, but I think that's a key piece to all of this. As a straight white male of privilege, he had to come out once his daughter was his son because he had a picture of a daughter on his desk. And even though he was the champion of the LGBT ERG, he still had to sort of come to grips with that and how he did that. And the organization was supportive. The other thing I would say, as you were mentioning, Sarah, in terms of some of the gender interesting sort of parallels and challenges, I also look at it as how can you rethink gender norms by expanding the definition of what you're trying to do. So for example, people talk about in the trans space, bathroom access, and we want to have gender neutral bathrooms. And people say, well, that's just for this teeny little percentage. Well, if you think about it in a broader perspective, in an organization, you're rethinking gender norms. You're rethinking what a leader looks like, as Kurt was talking about. You're rethinking as a trans person who can show up as their true selves. That's actually freeing a whole lot more people to be themselves in a very different way. Another way to look at it is when people were looking at prior to COVID, when so many people, including David Solomon from Goldman Sachs, say remote working can't work, it never works, and it's just for women because they have babies, right? That's the number one reason. And when we've done research, we found that the number one reason people wanted to work remotely was because of elder care, because their parents were returning to home to live with them. And if you frame it in that way, and then you role model that behavior, and a straight white male takes 2 days to work from home because his parents are living with him, that rethinks the norm of what is accessible, what is remote work. And so all of these things, I think, to your point, Sarah, are how this sort of plays out in a broader spectrum. So it's not about the other, it's about everyone. And then the final thing I would just say is from an LGBTQ perspective, which is the idea of an invisible minority and a visible minority, right? So if we're looking at race and gender, we're talking about things that are very easily measured. But we have done a great deal of work on measuring LGBTQ leaders in the workplace. And we found that companies measure self-identification in 38 countries around the world. So too often companies say, we can't measure LGBTQ people, we'll just measure what we can see. And I think that's a mistake. And I think what companies do for an invisible minority like LGBTQ people or mental illness or mental health and mental wellness actually sends a huge message to the visible minorities. And that's that cultural thing I think Emma's getting to.
And I would add to that,
Right, thanks so much, Todd.
I would add that the
Yes.
visible minorities are often covered by law and legal constructs in countries, but it's the invisible bits that often is not covered legally. And that's where people are most vulnerable. You don't have the legal background, but also, you've got to completely cover because it's not allowed to come out. Privilege is so dominant that you're not allowed to bring it out, and you're not covered legally. So it's a double whammy in many ways. Yeah.
And just finally to add to that, sorry, Renée.
No, I was just going to say, so we're approaching time. So do you want to have a quick response to that, Emma? And then
I think literally just to back what Todd said, globally, what am I focusing on at the moment? The big things for me, LGBT+ and mental health. Why? Because they're things we can hide. And this is so what Todd has said is what I'm living. And I absolutely believe that is the right way. It's the signal that it sends to the wider organization. And, you know, it is about rethinking norms. And until we actually do that, and we realize the stigma that exists still in many of our organizations and where we operate, and we actually do something about smashing that, then I think we won't make progress on any aspect of diversity. So that was all I wanted to say.
All right, so I was going to continue on, and I was given a stern warning that I need to wrap up. So I'm going to say that, and I noticed there's a comment from Carrie. This conversation is so rich; it would be great to make this a series. Let me reinforce this point. This is a very, very difficult issue that we're talking about. We've had an hour to start thinking about some of these things. That we could go on for weeks and weeks, right? This is a very, very important and fundamental issue, which has aspects of morality, business performance, cultural change. I mean, we're trying to change the world here, and we can't do it in an hour. But let me emphasize also the point I made at the beginning. It is very important to start talking about these things. So even though we have a little time, I'm very grateful to everyone who came and attended the session and also participated, because if we don't start talking about these things, nothing will ever happen. Let me just, I was supposed to maybe give a few practical points. You know, these are hard issues to solve. So I don't think there's any formulas. And I think this came across very clearly. One can't be programmatic, right? One has to be flexible. If you're flexible, how do you implement it? It's not so obvious, right? So I think it would do the topic an injustice to say that there are easy answers. I don't think there are any easy answers, but some of the things that we talked about are important, right? So measurement is important. Refraining from labeling, which in itself is in some sense stereotyping, is important. Being open-minded is important. Taking ownership is important. So I think all of these things have sort of come across as key themes. And let me reinforce again, talking about this is important, right? So that's the first step. With that, I think I would like to end and say thanks again for everyone for coming. And hopefully we can continue the conversation in future. And thanks very much to Todd, Kurt, and Emma for your very insightful comments. Please, everyone, join me in thanking them with a virtual applause. Hopefully, this was useful for you, and you will take some lessons with you along your journey. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.